In parental alienation, a child is rejecting a parent for a non-protective reason. In other words, that parent is safe, the child is protected and safe with that parent, and there was an unreasonable rejection due to an alienating influence.
If we rule out that there is no abuse and this child is not wanting to see them, we have to recognize that they're being abused by the other parent to not have a relationship with them. Because again, it's the child's right to have a relationship with them. And if that person is not supporting that and not recognizing their own role in not allowing that to happen, that's abuse. And then that child, if you notice, alienated children will defend them tooth and nail, just like you see these kids defending the people who are abusing them sexually.
It's something that's existed for many, many decades, and I think now we're reaching a point where we're starting to recognise that a child who says vehemently, I'm not going to see a parent after family separation, is a child that's waving a red flag.
It's also considered domestic violence because the intent of the behavior is to harm the other parent and the relationship with the child. And so many behaviors that alienators do aren't always involving the child. The child can be a weapon that's used against them, but they will engage in many, many behaviors just to hurt the other parent.
And if you've got a parent who demonstrates, who shows, who through their behaviour signals to the child that it's not acceptable for the child to have a relationship with the other parent, then the child will respond to that because their greatest anxiety is that that parent will become emotionally unavailable to them.
Parents are being accused falsely of sex abuse. Terrible, terrible. If a child believes the false story that they had been sexually abused by a parent, they are at the same risk potential for PTSD as if it actually had happened. This is criminal behavior, absolutely criminal behavior. The alienator is assaulting the child's memory, feelings, thinking, relationship with the parent. Assault is a crime.
So whenever I conduct trainings with mental health providers and lawyers as well, one question that always comes up is, how do I know whether it's alienation or the child is really being abused and they don't want to see the other parent?
So if you follow the model, there would be no way for an abused child to be considered alienated as long as we have accurate ways of determining if a parent has been abusive.
So when you see a child who is rejecting one parent, especially strongly, and you see a child, the same child, is strongly aligned with the other parent, probably that's an alienated child, not an estranged one.
Alienating parents use a lot of the same strategies of loyalty-inducing things that people who are trying to groom children to be sexually abused use.
And we have a lot of research about how profoundly dysfunctional and unstable an alienating parent is. Let's face it, a normal parent will not try to undermine the relationship between the child and the other parent. A normal parent appreciates that the child has a need for the other parent. And when the alienating parent can't appreciate that, they lack empathy, for one thing.
The model says that 4 things need to be present in order to know that a rejecting child is alienated. All 4 have to be present. So we try to set the bar pretty high so that we are not placing or considering an abused child as an alienated child.
For a child to reject a parent is not just about the dreadfulness of murdering a parent who is still alive and saying, I no longer want to have you in my consciousness. It's about the way that that child has murdered part of themselves and has then been forced to live with it. And it's only when that child comes into their young adulthood that perhaps the gravest consequences of what they've been forced to do really starts to come to light.
Parents who alienate their children are not only engaging in psychological abuse, but also even physical abuse and social isolation and other types of things to harm that child and keep them away from the other parent. But it does a lot of significant damage to that child and to their relationships with others.
This is evidence-based science. You don't just get to make it up. I think it's important, as an aside, to distinguish between science and a belief system, or science and ideology, or science and speculation.
I'm a scientist and I don't work with possibilities, like what's probable. Because when you're making decisions about children, you need to go with what the evidence says. And the evidence says abused children don't often act that way.
Why do we care if a rejecting child is alienated or estranged, right? Maybe it doesn't matter, but it does. And the reason it matters is because the treatment would be very different.
There's a concept in statistics and probability that turns out to be extremely relevant to these clinical cases. And that concept is the concept of a base rate, which I'll define in a minute, and ignoring the base rate, which is called base rate neglect.
And if you're looking for alienation and even other kinds of domestic violence, you have to look at patterns over time. Because abusive parents they use coercive control, they use ways to dominate the other person, and that you have to look deep and you have to look at it over an extended period of time.
If the professional doesn't have specialty level pattern recognition, or better yet, subspecialty level pattern recognition, you're liable to make a lot of mistakes and miss the important patterns.
Well, actions speak louder than words. I say immediately, you have to be able to reason backwards. When the alienating parent shows genuine support for the relationship between the other parent and child, you know it in how the child behaves. They will accept the other parent like this, like a light switch.
If you're using intuition, even when you shouldn't, then you tend to have great confidence in your incorrect conclusions. That's almost true by definition. It feels right. So no matter how wrong you are, if it was intuitive thinking, it feels right, and I'll repeat the catchy phrase, consequently, they tend to have great confidence in their incorrect conclusions, and that's a huge problem.
There's a kind of a perception that both parents must be contributing to the problem for this child to be rejecting them. You know, one parent must be doing something bad, and then the other parents, and they're both acting badly towards each other. And in my experience interviewing and talking to targeted parents and researching them, that a lot of them are really helpless. They have almost no power or control over what's happening in their lives, in their children's lives. The alienating parent really controls everything. They control access and communication to their child. Anything that parent will say to the child is interpreted by that child as negative and hostile towards the other parent who they're trying to protect. So my experience was that it's impossible for this person to reciprocate when you actually see the dynamics in these families.
What's going on here is the alienating parent tends to be a master manipulator, often an accomplished liar, brilliant at managing impressions, and so on, and is the aggressor who's winning. The other parent is a trauma victim.
So rather than sort of these children blossoming, they're kind of wilting under the care of the favored parent, and that's just profoundly frustrating, and that word doesn't just really begin to capture how painful it is for the targeted parent to go through that.
For one thing, it requires certain types of thinking that are not commonly taught to professionals. Some advanced medical concepts, for example, reasoning backwards from effect to cause, and conditional probability, which is the probability of one thing given another thing, or the probability of one event given that another event has already occurred. So not to get too technical, that's the first point. It requires special expertise, and that expertise is not necessarily common among the people who deal with these cases.
Typically, alienating parents are what we call narcissistically vulnerable. They feel very threatened when part of their identity is being diminished within the dissolution of the marriage, so they externalize the blame and project it outward towards the targeted parent. And the children get involved in that, and they're caught in the middle.
Usually, when you're dealing with alienation, it's one of three types, or a combination: borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, or some type of a sociopathic personality disorder.
And my most recent paper, we found that in the U.S., it's about 22 million adults are the victims of parental alienating behaviors, and they are not reciprocating the behaviors. So they are